Welcome to type mapping, an approach to understanding personality that does not label or restrict you. It incorporates a reality that we all recognize, but which has been sidelined by psychometric measurements of personality. And this reality is that human beings are enormously adaptable. We can read situations and change our behavior. We also have the potential to grow and mature. Type mapping takes you from where you are now and helps you to create your own future. So if you want to break free from the philosophy of current psychometric personality measures, then watch this video, and you will not only understand the limitations and confusions inherent in the old paradigm, but you will also find a way to help yourself and others to become agents in your own future. So this is what I will cover. Why we need new thinking in the assessment of personality. I will expose the assumptions that are embedded in the traditional psychometric approach to measurement. Then, how type mapping addresses the key issues. Once we recognize the blind spot in psychometric thinking, I will explain the necessity to separate who we are from what we do, the being from the doing. And then I will summarize two contrasting approaches. I will outline two fundamentally different philosophies about the human condition that contrast type mapping with traditional psychometric approaches. Let's begin with how traditional questionnaires build a profile. Essentially, they ask the question, who are you, in one form or another. You then say what is most like you typically or in the average of situations. Now, if we accept Albert Einstein's wisdom that everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler, then I suggest that such questionnaires transgress this simple maxim. Most people agree that people are indeed both complex and often mysterious. Understanding how and why they do things is not always easy, and one of the most memorable and dramatic illustrations of this is Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Most of us may not be quite as dramatic as that, but we all have different sides to our character, which are expressed at different times. Does this mean that we have two or more personalities? In this example, the two sides represent good and evil, or the bright side and the dark side. Certainly, a personality questionnaire that asks about the typical you, or the you in the average of situations, would present a challenge for Dr. Jekyll. If we accept that we all have flexibility in our behavior, then traditional personality profiles may often be guilty of identifying a meaningless average. For Dr. Jekyll, this would be a point that represents the middle of nowhere. Now, let's use another lens to try to understand people's flexibility and the changes in their behavior. One of the most quoted psychological experiments was conducted by Stanley Milgram, who, because of the horrors of the Nazis in World War II, wanted to know whether all human beings could succumb to implementing such horrors. His subjects were asked to torture, i.e. apply electric shocks, to a fellow participant, who was in fact a stooge. He found that many of his subjects continued applying increasing amounts of shock, even though they could hear the stooge screaming in pain. Milgram's conclusion was that, given the right conditions, in this case the white coats with apparent legitimate authority, people were capable of shockingly cruel behavior. This demonstrates the importance of context in determining what we do. People are likely to behave differently in the role of obedient subject compared to the role of responsible parent, for example. Few would deny that people do show variability and flexibility in what they do, and so the traditional personality questionnaire merges all of these into one score, an indeterminate and insensitive mix of many things that ignores variability. At times, such a summary can be useful, but we need to recognize that it can also be a significant misrepresentation of a person's style and range. Let me illustrate using a real-world example. Don Corleone, the Godfather, here played by Marlon Brando, as the mafia boss, illustrates the dilemma nicely. Consider the scenes where he talks to his son about being a caring father, spending time with his family, showing concern, principles, compassion. Contrast this with the scenes where he orders the death of his enemies with no compunction, no compassion. So is he cruel or compassionate, or both? And are we all capable of flexing our behaviour to some degree? This duality, this flexibility, requires that we think more carefully about how we describe and measure personality. As previously mentioned, the most common method of measuring personality is to ask people about how they are typically, or on average. The results are then summarised as a profile, which shows the degree to which one person's answers differed from another, usually on a scale of 1 to 10. Now consider the Godfather's answers. Perhaps his perception of himself is that he is a caring individual, protecting his family, and he explains his seemingly cruel behaviour as a necessity to protect that family. Traditionally, questionnaires would classify this as part of the agreeableness scale. Where would he score on this? We might be interpreting his non-compassion or cruelty as part of his character or personality, but he sees it as a necessary role. We must remember that the traditional personality questionnaires tap into a person's story and belief about themselves. Personality measurement needs to recognize that sometimes a midpoint can be a poor representation of the person. As is well illustrated in Todd Rose's book, The End of Average, where he illustrates how very few people actually fit the average profile. I should make it clear that I am not suggesting that traditional personality profiles are meaningless. I know that averages can be very useful, but they can also be too simplistic and they can be misapplied. Unfortunately, built into the psychometric methodology are underlying assumptions that result in a blind spot. The approach does not give sufficient consideration to the importance of context. And context has been recognized by people other than Milgram. Walter Mischel, for example, made a robust critique of trait theory back in 1968 and argued for the recognition of situations for influencing and hence predicting behavior, as he says in his book. The same point has been made by other notable social learning theories such as Bandura, as well as broader psychologists such as Professor Jerome Kagan, whose first chapter in Psychology's Ghost is entitled Missing Context. And stretching back even further to the inspiration for type mapping, Carl Jung, he also made the case for factoring in the environment, as illustrated here. To better understand this psychometric blind spot, consider one of the psychometric mantras, reliability. In measurement terms, this means we rely on the numbers it generates. It is accurate. Now consider measuring these two people's heights. How many elastic bands tall are they versus the number from a calibrated tape measure? Reliability in psychometrics is based on that which gives us more consistent results, an idea borrowed from the physical sciences. On this basis, the tape measure becomes less accurate, less reliable, less consistent when measuring this father's son over the next 10 years. This demonstrates how consistency is not the same thing as accuracy. It only works when measuring attributes that don't change. And the question of whether personality changes over time is still open, not least because we are still debating what personality really is. The problem for psychometrics is that it presents indices of reliability based on consistency, which people conflate with accuracy. This only works for measures that do not change, and achieving consistency has become a goal that influences how questionnaires are developed and refined. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, whereby elements that detect change get removed. Whilst I cannot do full justice to this topic here, we must remember that psychometrics offers consistency as a proxy for accuracy and calls it reliability. So let's consider a little further the question of whether personality changes. To illustrate this again, reliability is what it's called, this is what accuracy looks like, and this is what consistency looks like, the proxy for accuracy. So let's consider a little further the question of whether personality changes. I certainly believe that there are some deep constitutional factors involved in what is called personality. But remember that self-report questionnaires do not measure DNA. They invite people to report their current perception of themselves, or possibly their past perception if they're asked to give the first answer that comes to them. They are articulating who they think they are, and this can, does, and maybe should change with increasing maturity. Change does not have to mean a transformation. It may simply be the emergence of hitherto latent characteristics. The other psychometric mantra is validity, an even bigger topic. Some will argue that reliability doesn't matter if we show predictive validity. Does our measure hit the target? The trouble is defining the target, the desired outcome. Are we shooting at the right thing? Is it clearly defined? Has it moved? The reality is that real-life outcomes are usually complex, unclear, and changing. Add to this that people also want to change and grow, we have two moving parts. But the predictive model is rather static. A measure here, at this point in time, correlates with this measure there at another point in time. Now, other kinds of validity, such as construct validity, do bring additional elements into the equation, but they are all related and rely on analyses of groups to make broad generalizations. Now, physicists may have general laws that apply to gases, but would not be so foolish as to use these laws to predict the movements of individual molecules. Are developers and users of psychometrics falling into the trap of overgeneralizing from small validity coefficients based on large groups and applying them to individuals based on a static model? Of course, generalized findings have value, but they are often applied beyond their range of usefulness, and you can refer back to the overuse of averages made earlier in this video. Against this backdrop, let me suggest more dynamic ways of conceptualizing personality. We know that different situations bring out different characteristics. Perhaps personality is more like an MRI scan. Different stimuli activate different characteristics in the same way as different parts of the brain light up. So personality could be a mosaic of characteristics that shine differently in different lights. But another metaphor is that of the unfinished painting. This immediately evokes change, growth, and development. Even if we are all born with a basic canvas, with some vague, predetermined outline, it is life and situations that determine the colours, the order in which they're filled in, and the degree to which the edges are blended or distorted. The psychometric approach to personality was, initially, very useful. In the early chaos of multiple terms and attributes, it has provided some outline, shape and structure in the form of the Big Five model. But every step of progress becomes its own limitation. Is the approach now a shackle, which has, having sought greater simplicity, is now guilty by Einstein's statement that everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler? But we do not want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The concept of personality as that part of me which I take across time and situations is very useful, but its relationship to behaviour is more complex. A useful metaphor is to think of life as a tug of war. On the one hand, our circumstances pull us in a certain direction, let's call this the outside. On the other hand, our inner nature resists or avoids a situation, so let's call this the inside, which will involve a mix of personality, values and competencies, etc. What is the result is what we do. Our behaviour is in between. Of course, some people are more adaptable or chameleon-like than others, but we all, to some degree, choose the roles we play. Hence, a behavioural role is the chosen behaviour that results from the tension between the inside and the outside. And this is precisely what the type mapping system maps. We use the ITPQ, the Ideal Task Profile Questionnaire, to map the pressures or challenges of the situation. We use the TDI, or the Type Dynamics Indicator, to map our personality, what we prefer to do if circumstances did not pressure us in another direction. And we use the MTRI, Managing Team Role Indicator, to describe the result, the behaviour that we end up doing in particular situations. Using these three lenses, we can begin to untangle some rather confused thinking behind some popular questionnaires. First of all, let's consider the concept of a work personality. What does it mean? You are invited to think about how you typically behave at work. Does this identify your personality or your role? Probably a bit of both. Hence, should the OPQ, which requires you to think of yourself at work, be described as a personality or as a role questionnaire? And now let's consider the most popular team role questionnaire, Belbin, which invites you to allocate points between sets of behavioural statements to indicate which of those behaviours you feel most apply to you. No specific situation is suggested, and so your answers are generalizations across situations, which is more in line with the traditional idea of a personality. Perhaps a team personality would be more accurate. These two examples illustrate the confusion between role and personality. Type mapping clarifies the confusion because it does not use behaviour as the barometer for personality. It uses preferences. It also ensures the roles are described with specific situations in mind, which highlights how people can adapt their role when faced with different challenges. It means letting go of the belief that behaviour is the best hard evidence of a person's inner nature without understanding the context. The reality is that psychometrics has a static view of human attributes, or if not quite static, at least it's backwards looking. Consider major influences within psychology. We have B.F. Skinner, the behaviourist, or Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst, or Ray Cattell, the intelligence and personality researcher. All were pioneers and all had very different views of what makes people tick. However, what they all had in common was a reductive view. They sought to explain who I am today by past events, and they're focused on answering the question, how I became who I am today. But there is another approach which may be more in tune with people in the learning and development field. For example, Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, and Carl Jung, most known for Psychological Types. Their approach can be described as constructivist. They believe that we are driven by purpose, and hence they focus on where I am going rather than where I have been. And they're trying to answer the question, what am I becoming? This is a fundamentally different question. The former tends towards how people are limited by their past and constitution, and the latter towards how we can shape our own destiny. We are agents in our own future. Of course, the truth is, as ever, a bit of both. Those wishing to facilitate growth and change would find a more dynamic and evolving model more useful. This does not mean that change is then easy, especially where there can be constitutional constraints, but the type mapping model is specifically designed to facilitate awareness, growth, change and flexibility, which I will describe in the next video. You can use each questionnaire independently, But if you want to explore what people are doing or contributing to a situation using the MTRI, you can then see what they think they ought to be doing and contributing using the ITPQ. As you can see here, they're not the same. And then underneath it all, you can see whether a person is using their preferences in the role that they are playing, the source of a rich conversation if they are not. So using all three questionnaires helps to diagnose issues for individuals, but when applied to teams, this can identify how it is functioning and what it needs to do to improve. There are plenty of ways to present the results from the three questionnaires, and in this team, for example, the balance of preferences is quite one-sided, as shown here. By analysing what they thought the team needed to focus on, shows a very different picture. It appears that they all had different ideas about what the team needed to focus on or do differently. So in this team, until there was greater commonality, all attempts at team building were doomed. I hope this has given you some small insight into what this carefully integrated approach to understanding people and building relationships has to offer. To find out more about type mapping, you can watch 3 videos that expand the way we explore personality using the TDI, how we identify the roles we play using the MTRI, and how we can analyse the challenges we face in different situations using the ITPQ. And using all 3 together provides a useful map for both individuals and teams, as demonstrated in a final video which brings them all together. If you want to use these questionnaires, you are welcome to get in touch, and thank you for listening.